Is it worth spending time learning how to learn Chinese, or should you focus all your efforts on engaging with the language more directly? The answer is that it depends, but the longer your time frame, the more important it becomes to tweak your method. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about whether or not it's useful to listen to this podcast or read my articles or take my courses. I think it should be clear that I think it's important because otherwise Hacking Chinese wouldn't exist and I wouldn't record this episode. And I also think there's a fair chance that you think it's interesting and useful as well, because otherwise you wouldn't be listening. But I do think the question of how important it is to learn how to learn and how much time you should invest doing so is important. Some people don't do it enough and some people maybe do it too much. If in doubt, and this is particularly true since you're listening to this episode, I think it's better to spend more time engaging directly with the language. We learn by listening and reading to things in Chinese, not listening or reading to someone discussing how to do that in English. So essentially what I'm saying is that listening to my podcast or reading my articles has an opportunity cost. You could turn this episode off right now and listen to something in Chinese instead. So the question then is, why do I think it is worthwhile spending time focusing on your learning method, even if that in itself doesn't teach you any Chinese directly? Let's illustrate this with a race between two cyclists who have different approaches to the race. So we have cyclist A and B, and they are the same when it comes to endurance, skill, and so on, but they differ in their approach, as I said. Cyclist A sets out immediately at a pace of 25 kilometers per hour, but cyclist B, in contrast, spends 4 hours watching videos about proper cycling technique, maybe upgrades their bike, or otherwise tweak their method before setting out. Because of these upgrades, they are now able to pedal away at a higher speed, let's say 30 kilometers per hour. If this race is short, it should be obvious that A will win every time, because, well, they started much earlier and has a 4-hour head start, which is a lot. There are many situations which are like that when you study Chinese. So, for example, if you have a test next week, cramming works much better than spaced repetition, which I would normally recommend. And it should be abundantly clear that reading my article about whether or not cramming is a valid method is not time well spent if you have a test next week. You're better off using any reasonable method you can find that allow you to actually prepare for the exam. Similarly, if you have a 听写 or dictation exam tomorrow, rote learning is actually quite useful. It's much faster than learning how Chinese characters work, break all the characters down into components and understand how they fit together, and maybe create some fancy mnemonics. These are all things that I recommend that you do normally, but when the finish line is in sight, that's not the right time to start tweaking your method. However, for most people, learning Chinese is a long-term project. You do not learn primarily to pass the exam next week or get a good score on tomorrow's 听写, but instead you have other goals for learning Chinese. Some of them might take months, some of them might take years or even decades. And so if we're comparing cyclists again, the length of the race is very important. Cyclist A, who set out immediately at 25 kilometers per hour, will win if the race is shorter than 600 kilometers. The reason is, of course, that in the time B spent upgrading their method or their equipment or something, A will have gathered a 100-kilometer head start. Since B's speed is 5 kilometers faster, it takes 20 hours to catch up, or 600 kilometers. So as we can see in this made-up example, but also in the example with the exam next week and the 听写 tomorrow, just do it works pretty well as a method as long as you're focusing on something reasonable. Spending too much time thinking about strategy or how you learn Chinese doesn't really pay off in the short run. Now, if we make the race longer, let's say Tour de France length, that's usually about 3,500 kilometers in total, sacrificing a few hours to upgrade your speed will be well worth it, and B, in this case, with the same setup, would finish the whole race roughly 23 hours faster than A. Still, even if Tour de France is a longer race, it's over in little more than 3 weeks, and most study Chinese for much longer than that, and our time frame is not in weeks, like I said, it's in years or maybe even decades. If it were possible to circumvent the Earth on a bike and we extend the race to that length, that would then mean that B arrives 11 days before A, and this is still very short compared to how long it takes to learn Chinese. So the point here is, of course, that if you're going to invest hundreds or thousands or even tens of thousands of hours into learning Mandarin, thinking a little bit about how you learn is important because even a tiny upgrade will make a big difference over the years. I used a race here just to show that the length of the race is important, but of course learning Chinese is not a race and there are many things that don't fit into this illustration. Sometimes the difference between methods is huge. You could spend time learning something that is completely useless, for example, and then your speed is actually 0, not 25 versus 30. And sometimes the difference is much bigger than that as well. So for example, if you were to try to learn to, say, write 2,500 characters by hand using only rote learning, this will take many times longer than if you use spaced repetition and flashcards. When the difference between methods is very big, it's important to spend some time learning how to learn early on. So for example, when it comes to characters, if you have these dictation exams or 听写, or you're required to write characters by hand in some other form, it pays off handsomely to learn a little bit about how characters work and how you can learn them effectively, rather than just writing them over and over, which is horribly inefficient. So far, I've discussed why it makes more sense to spend time tweaking your method the longer the time frame is. But let's also have a look at the other example, because it's certainly possible to spend too much time thinking about how to learn. When people realize that there are radically different ways of approaching learning Chinese, it's easy to get stuck and spend most of your time thinking about how to do something. Because after all, if you know that you will be doing this for years, even finding a 1% increase in the efficiency of your method can be very valuable. So it's tempting to just try to find that optimization right now, because it's going to save you a lot of time later. Well, maybe, but there's also a risk that you're not in a position to evaluate whether your method is slightly better or not. And this is something you might only figure out after you actually start using the method. And there's also a risk that you get stuck choosing between different methods and not actually studying Chinese. And as I said initially in this episode, you learn Chinese by engaging directly with the language, not by thinking about how to learn it. Also, as I'm fond of saying, even a bad method that you use is better than a good method that you don't use. Or to put it in other words, if you don't actually study Chinese, it doesn't matter how good your method is. Let's now turn to another issue with the cycling analogy I used earlier, and that is that the time is not fixed. In a race, people pedal the whole way until they reach the finish line, and that's it. But when it comes to learning Chinese, this is not how it works. As adults, we have other things we do in life, and it's not a given that we will spend all the time we can on learning Chinese. So the total amount of time we spend depends on many things, including things like motivation and how inspired we feel. I receive a fair amount of positive feedback from listeners and readers, and most of it is actually not about the information that I provide in the articles, but about inspiration, that people feel encouraged to learn Mandarin and study more, and then this will lead to better results, even if the method itself wasn't actually better. Of course, I hope that Hacking Chinese is both inspiring and informative, but I'll leave it up to you to judge that. It's time to wrap up this episode. I think Hacking Chinese should be a complement to your learning, not a substitute for listening and reading. And as I said, I hope that by listening to my podcast and reading my articles, your method will be better and you will therefore learn more, or you will be inspired and thereby invest more time, or hopefully both. If you've listened this far, I think it's safe to say that you've filled your How to Learn Chinese meter for the day, and it's time to engage more directly with the language through listening and reading. And if you're not sure what to listen to or read, I've put links in the show notes to get you started. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.